that. Hey, today we're going to talk about multiplication for every church, how to begin your journey towards 100x impact. And so anyway, hey, I'm excited about this topic, but when I look at it, Mike, it's sort of 100x impact. I want to ask the question.
It's a big claim. It's a big claim, David. It's a little bit Tony Robbins, David Goggins kind of like, can you run 100 miles? Can you dude, what does this mean? Like, are we over promising? What does 100x mean, David?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a great question. And, first of all, I want to say that, you know what? As strange as it may sound, I don't think this is an overpromise. I want us to begin. Let's look at some scripture that has become foundational to my own life and as a multiplier. And we find it in Mark 4. This is foundational right here. And I think anyone who's interested in seeing multiplication or seeing disciple-making movements or living in that world, this scripture really comes home. Of course, I'm just going to read a shortened version of it, Mark 4, verse 8, and then I want to read verse 13. And I want everybody to really hear this today. But the parable is of the sower, and we get down to the fourth type of soil, which is the good soil. And it says, still other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew. Of course, Jesus is speaking. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, some multiplying 30. Listen to this. Some multiplying 30, some 60, some 100 times. So that's, obviously where we get the 100 times. And then what really captivated my heart a number of, a couple years ago, really recent, is verse 13. So Jesus ends the parable, and then he addresses his disciples in an almost seemingly more intimate kind of way, and then he explains the parable. But in verse 13, it's transitional, and he says, then Jesus said to them, don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable? And when I read that, what really stood out in my mind was, here is Jesus laying the foundation. What is a parable? A parable is a lesson about the kingdom. And here Jesus is laying a foundation for how the kingdom grows. And then he stops them right in the middle of it. And it was like he's stopping me that morning. I was reading it. And he says, hey, wait a minute, David. You've got to get this before you get anything else. And what is it? You've got to get multiplication. In other words, the way it hit me, I'd spent most of my life focusing on addition, adding one disciple at a time. And now I'm reading the scripture like I've been reading it for 60 years, and I'm reading the scripture, and all of a sudden, like I'm reading it for the first time, and I've missed the first lesson. And that Jesus built his kingdom to grow not on addition, but on multiplication. And the answer is Jesus's kingdom, his way, can yield 30, 60, 100-fold.
Yeah, I think part of the problem, David, is we look at this and we've inherited some ministry practices and mindsets that have been effective at adding and having an impact. But those very things that help us add, they prevent us from multiplying. And so this promise that Jesus gives us, that 100 times impact, we have to let go of some of those old practices and embrace some things that might feel risky, that may feel unknown, that maybe we're not as good at. But if we can make that transition, I think that's something not only exciting, but something the American church needs.
Yeah. And let me just add, that just from perspective for everyone who's listening, and we're so grateful that you would join us today, is that I come to you as a practitioner, not simply a theorist of multiplication. Now, I'm a theorist about a lot of things, and as part of the role of the consulting coach is to be thinking ahead. But we are actively engaged, making disciples who are making disciples in our local community that have grown to the third and now the fourth generation. And so this next verse sort of, and this last scripture I'm going to give you today, I think, but everything I do in terms of ministry and growth and all those things now is based on Jesus's teaching. I've just sort of gotten out of all the other stuff. But this verse perfectly describes what we're experiencing in our local community, where we are seeing just some incredible things happen in the area of multiplication. And I love this too. And this is Mark 4 again. And this follows, yeah, go to the next slide, I think. Oh, here it is. Yeah. So Mark 4, 26 and 28. Now listen to this. This is another one that just will sort of stop you in your tracks. This is what the kingdom of God is like. A man scatters seeds on the ground. Listen to this. It's unbelievable. Night and day, whether he sleeps or get up, the seed sprouts and grows, though he does not know how. All by itself, the soil produces grain. Now, just let that sink in for a minute. And now imagine your ministry like growing like this. Imagine not only 100 times impact, but imagine 100 times impact, and you don't even know how to explain it. You don't even, I mean, I've been a church planter. I planted my first church in 1988. And I'm telling you, church planting and multiplying and reproducing has always been really hard work for me, But I read this, and then what I'm experiencing at this point in my life is just so radically different. And I think it's accessible to everybody.
I love that, David. And I think that this business about night or day, sleeping or getting up, working hard, not working hard, I think it's hard for us to know what it is we're doing that's working in ministry, what it is we're doing that's not working. And it's really tempting to take credit for the work of God. And even emotionally, we may not do that cognitively. We may not take credit for it. Like, we may not say that, but we feel special when things work. And when people show up in the room and we see people coming to the altar, we think, wow, I did something great. And we should keep doing those things that are effective. But I think sometimes it's hard to differentiate, man, the work of God is happening while I sleep. And yes, I need to put my hand to the plow like Jesus calls me to. But how do I know what the right thing is and what's not? I think it can be hard to know.
Yeah, so it's his ministry, his way. And if you go to the next slide, here's the challenge that we face, and we're going to get into really the nuts and bolts of the content here. But the challenge is we don't know how to multiply. At least I didn't. I'm learning how, but I didn't know how to multiply for so many years. Didn't even know I was supposed to multiply. Didn't know, just missed it altogether. And then what further, drives home the challenges in churches, we don't know how to multiply, but here churches with an addition-based growth engine are losing ground. That we're losing ground. We're adding, and we're working harder than ever to add, but the truth of the matter is we're losing ground. And this next chart sort of demonstrates that. It's a simple chart, but one is, I hope you find encouragement from this. Like, this chart is discouraging, but hopefully somehow it will encourage us, because it sort of takes the light off of us as individuals and helps us see the whole of the problem. But this is a survey that Gallup has been doing since really before 1940. I think they started in 1937. And so and what they were measuring is church membership among US adults. And this came out in 2020. And the reason I use this stat is they were putting it out annually till COVID. And now that I'm waiting on the next one, it's going to be real interesting. But what I want you to notice is way back in 1940-ish, I mean, we were at 73%. And this is And then if you follow it along the line in the year 2000, where were we? Look at it real quick, guys. We were at 70%. So this period from 37 to 2000 of 63 years, we fluctuate. Yeah, there were times we were all the way down to 68%, but really there was a small, margin of difference. But then in 2000, something happened. And look at the number in 2020. We went from 70% to 47%. So something radically happened in our culture, and that would be another, that's a whole book to explain that one. But something radically happened, and we began to go through this rapid decline, and no longer did we see the kind of results that we had previously seen. And so what we're seeing more, let me give you a basic answer one of my mentors gave me one time when we're talking about why we're not seeing more in church growth, church planting, church everything. And I thought at the time I was a young man, I thought we could resolve the issue with money. And he says, no, it's more basic than that, David. We've reached everyone like us or everyone who wants to be like us. In other words, this idea of come and see, we've reached all the people who want to come and see. And so we need a, radically different paradigm if we're going to move forward and see the kingdom advance. And I believe that God's kingdom, we're going to see some of the greatest growth in history in the coming decades. The question becomes, are we going to be a part of it? I give you one more sort of anecdotal thing. Years ago, I heard Lynn Sweet make a comment. He says, the movement of God is not like a hurricane. A hurricane comes in and wipes out everything. He says it's like a tornado. It's more random in nature. It touches down here, here, and here. He says if we'd ever learn how to connect the dots. And so I think the movement of God is like a tornado. So the question becomes, are we going to be a part of that? Are we going to be one of those dots in the equation?
So David, this is a sobering chart, and from the health of the church in North America, there's obvious concerns here about people claiming to be members. And of course, this chart, if we look at it closely, we see it's overall engagement in religious institutions. So it's not. Yeah. I think most of this is church data, but there's some synagogue. There's the point here is that for some of our pastors who are on this call, they may be seeing hopefully not catastrophic trends like this in their church, but helps them interpret a little bit what's going on in their own context and why it's harder. And this is, in the 2000s, we were still very much in that growth-oriented church growth era. There was all kinds of books and seminars and tactics and tricks, and everything got better in terms of production value in most churches. And yet that's when we see this decline, this rapid decline. And as we all know, COVID did not help this. And we all know that the attendance since COVID is not fully recovered. And there has been some damage, particularly among at-risk groups like the younger population, unmarried, folks who are a couple cultural degrees of separation away from the average church member in North America. So there's reason to be concerned for sure. And yet you're still suggesting we have a solution here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you pointing that out, because one of the ways I use this chart is to say, hey, if you're experiencing decline, you're not alone. You're not alone. I go and I talk with teams and boards all the time, and they think, we that lead the church, we're the problem. And it's far from truth, because we're going through this major change in it. But it is our responsibility to recognize that God is up to something, that God is up to something new, and what's not working is not working, and it's time to look, And again, for me, that begins by looking at those key verses about, hey, that part of the problem is that we built everything on an addition-based, almost consumeristic approach to ministry, but Christ has called us very simply to multiply disciples who make disciples and to plant churches that plant churches, and doing ministry God's way can produce 100-time results. Now, this is also one of those places where, you know, other parts of the world are leading the charge here, and the future is already happening. It's just happening in other less developed areas. You know, there's a bit of a challenge here. But anyway, let's look at the solution, or start talking about the solution a little bit, and talking about multiplication. Now, let me set a little context for this. We have been working, Mike, for a year, I would say, or longer, with Exponential. And by the way, guys, we'll be at Exponential. We'll be unpacking a lot of this stuff with them and others. And what we've been doing is working on this thing called the Multiplier's Journey. And it's, you know, it's a process to help churches move from addition to multiplication, you know. And so this is their model here. I won't get into a whole lot of that. I'll tell you a little bit more about it at the end. But this is what Exponential call the 5 levels of multiplication. And it paints another picture for us to look at and sort of gain perspective of the church. And it's pretty simple to understand. You know, there's level 1, which is subtraction. So, you know, churches that are subtracting, that they're declining in decline. Level 2, churches that are plateau. 3, churches that are adding. 4th, churches that are reproducing. And 5th, churches are multiplying. Now, just to make a little bit of a distinction in this model for you guys that are watching this that may not be familiar with it, reproducing. And by the way, this is not this is laid out linear. It's not always linear. You know, there are a lot of churches. So, for example, level 4 reproduction is churches that are adding new churches in a more what would you say, addition-based programmatic kind of approach. It would be like me saying, hey, I'm going to get into church planting, and we're going to put money in our budget to help church planting. We're going to bring an intern on, and we're going to send him out. We're going to send a handful of people with him. You know, it's sort of that adding one church at a time kind of mentality. Multiplication is this idea of making disciples who make disciples that plant churches to the 4th generation. And so that's, you know, so the question becomes, wherever we are, I mean, you almost immediately know where you are on this scale of 1 to 5, you know, is the question becomes, what's your multiplication dream? Where are you going? And then how do you get there? And so this is just a picture. Now, if you go to the next slide, which is more of the, well, just some fill-ins here. Here's a snapshot of, this is really interesting, Mike. 70% of churches we see here, we all hear this stuff, usually sort of anecdotally, but 70% of churches are on level 1 or level 2 of multiplication, which is subtracting, is declining or plateau. So 70%, I've seen numbers up to 80% of churches in the U.S. plateau or decline.
Where is this data from? Is this pre-COVID data?
This data specifically came, yes, it was done in 2019 by Lifeway Research for Exponential. Okay. So, and then the second figure here is that, and, you know, to me, this is a bit encouraging, that 30% of churches are growing, you know. So, I mean, nearly a third of churches are growing. That's, you know, I want to see 100% of our churches growing or reproducing or multiplying, but there are churches that are growing out there.
So, David, how is it possible that churches can be growing, but the number of people who go to church in North America seems to be in decline? And that previous slide kind of implies that. I know it's about membership, but how is it we can have churches growing but not have churches, not actually have more people coming to church?
Well, I really think, yeah, that's the good news, bad news,
Mhm.
and I think the good news, I want to say the good news first is that there are churches out there that are reaching people with the gospel. There are churches that are moving out, into where people live, work, and play, and they're effectively reaching new disciples. But unfortunately, many of these churches, many times our churches, we grow at our own expense,
Right.
meaning, and I think we see this with COVID. And a good example of this is that, there's this large group of newly de-churched people in our culture today. Like the sort of the seeker movement helped us reach. We did a really great job at reaching de-churched people. And what I mean by that is people who had dropped out. They had a positive predisposition towards us in church, at least towards Christ, but they sort of dropped out along the way. So we did a good job of reaching them. Now, guess what? We've got a new pool of people that are de-churched. And these are the people that we read about every day. And these are the people that you know about that are no longer showing up at your church, And typically they're doing one or two things. They're watching something online or they're moving to another church. So a lot of churches are growing at the expense of our decline. So the good news is we're still reaching lost people. God's still drawing lost people. The bad news is the way we operate as a church when we're driven by addition and sort of an addition only mindset is, sometimes and oftentimes we do it at the expense of one another.
Yeah, it makes me think of some of the research by Ed Stetzer and Warren Bird that indicates that new churches reach lost people much more effectively than established churches, and that a church that's 10, 15, 25, 35 years old tends to plateau at that 35-year mark. That's just the data. And they have a hard time reaching new converts, whereas a new church is 1 to 5 years old, has a much higher conversion ratio amongst the people who are in it. And again, I'm not a church planner, but my local church engagement is with a church plant, and I'm seeing a lot of young people who don't know Jesus in the worship service, saying yes to Jesus for the first time. But what happens is when we have a growth mentality, an ad mentality, we tend to grab other Christians from other churches. None of us mean to do that, but it happens. And we're not reaching those who are seeking faith for the first time as well. But it seems like that multiplying mindset is so promising, in part because this is much more effective at reaching people who are seeking faith for the first time. And that is what can increase the kind of the market share of Christianity in North America.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Now, keep in mind that it doesn't take very long for new churches to sort of get in the same rut of addition. After say about 10 years, we begin to lose our effectiveness in evangelism. And so my burden today is not simply to plant for new churches to be planted. I think we need to plant a different kind of new church. And it's a new church that multiplies, that makes disciples who make disciples, et cetera, et cetera. But also, I would say that any and every church can multiply. And we have 350,000 churches in the US. And I always say our first harvest field is our local churches, because they're filled with undiscipled people who can be discipled, who could become disciple makers, who could live sent in this world and could form new communities of disciples. But, and go on to that next slide, we need to keep moving for sake of time. But, we need, so multiplication is not just a conversation for churches that are level, they're 3, they're growing. Now, what do we do next? It could even be for churches that are 1, that are dying and saying, what are we going to do next? Because I believe that it may be a church in decline, their only play is to begin to make disciples. And I work with a lot of churches on a regular basis. It's one of the things I do in helping them sort of transition from this addition to multiplication. And I'm telling you, all I need, because the scripture says this, think about the parable again, is the seed, which is the gospel, right? Finding good soil. If there's good soil left in a church, the heart of man, if there's enough desperation, we can experience, there's two types of changes. There's evolutionary change. That would be sort of like 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. But there's revolutionary change from 1 to 5, from 2 to 5, from 3 to 5. That's more of a revolutionary kind of change. And I think Jesus came, and, to be honest with you, he had a pretty progressive revolutionary message.
Right. So what is the new multiplication paradigm?
Yeah, so these are just some of the, we need to flip some switches in our own processes. And here are just some thoughts along that way. For example, the first one, and they're all up here at one time, but that's fine, from hero to hero maker. Okay, now I'm borrowing from Exponential's language if you're familiar with it. But this is so key. You see, I mean, even our polity communicates that as an ordained minister, I am the hero. And what we have to do is we have to go from being the hero, being the center, being the leader, to being the hero maker. Give you an example, in our local disciple making movement that we're experiencing right now. I've got the very first guy I discipled, and I travel a lot, I'm gone a lot, and so I'm in and out. And so much of what is happening in our community is happening in spite of me. And what I've had to come to realize is that, hey, it's not my role to be the center of that movement. Matter of fact, I've got to decrease. I've got to get out of the way. But people around me need to be, how do I make heroes out of the people around me? How, who do I see, and how do I place my hands on them? I'll give you another example real quick. Joe is one of our disciple makers, new disciple makers, never been a disciple maker in his life. And I saw the potential in him. We go to lunch and I look at Joe and I said, Joe, you're a leader. You're going to be a leader. You're going to be a disciple maker. And Joe's response to me was, I've been waiting on somebody to tell me that all my life. And my question is, and it probably happened to all of us at some point. I remember a pastor looking at me and saying, God has a special plan for your life. God's going to work through. I actually believed it. I was 19 years old at the time. I believed it. So we got to go from being hero to hero maker in the church. Okay. Number two, we have to go from consumers to disciples who make disciples. So I think what we've sort of done is we've allowed people to consume, but by offering programs. And what we've got to do is we've got to make our primary engine disciple making. But it's more than that. See, the problem is we all have disciples, but the question is, are we making disciple makers? And the thing that changes and the thing that gets the flywheel of multiplication going, the most basic core component, is making disciples who make disciples. Well, in our, again, little community of disciple makers, we don't count how many disciples we have. We count how many disciple makers do we have, And so in our local churches, oftentimes, you think about it, we as staff or as leaders in the church, usually staffs and pastor types, we're the disciple makers. Everybody else is the disciples. Well, that's a problem. That doesn't produce multiplication. So we need this transition from consumer to disciple maker, from volunteer, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute when we show you another model, to instead of and again, I'm just, all I can do is confess sin today, my own short, maybe not, whatever it is. But we had a church that we planted here in the Atlanta area, and we boasted that we have 70% of our 2,000 people in attendance in volunteerism. We simply meant they stood at the door and greeted people or served coffee or parked cars. And somehow that falls short of the Ephesians 2:10 model. And so we have to move from this mental mindset of, hey, how many volunteers do we have to run the organization, to, hey, missionaries, sending missionaries where we live, work, and play. So it's sort of an expectation thing. What do we expect from people? Why would we expect anything other than them taking up the cross and following him? Next one from this is really big, and again, this comes right from Exponential Made for More book that Todd Wilson put together. We can do it. So here's our posture as a church. We can do it. You can help. But we need to transition to, you do it. You can do it. You can do it, Mike. David, you can do it. We can help you. And that's a radical shift in mindset, And then the last one is really a scorecard transition, which is from counting attendance numbers, which is, we get into oftentimes we count the wrong things, nickels and noses, to, again, going back to what I said earlier, counting disciple makers, counting groups outside of church, et cetera, et cetera. So when I think about multiplication paradigm, these are the 5 things that tend to help us shift from addition to multiplication.
So we have to let go of some of the old paradigms that I'm the hero, that I'm providing all this expertise, that I'm looking for people to help me run the church, to I can do it and you can help me, to counting success as having more people show up. We have to let go of some of those things so that we can, because we can either add or we can multiply. And this goes back to the beginning. We can't do both. They actually fight against each other. And even the multiplying is going to require that we give away, right? That we actually send people out to do things, that we plant other expressions of church somewhere else that's not here. But we have to embrace a new paradigm. Tell us a little bit, David, about this challenge of that level 3 magnet.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a great graphic here. And if you notice, there's actually 3 magnets. They're what we call level 1, and then level 3, and then lastly beyond level 5. And each one of these, think about a magnet. A magnet has a force that draws you into it. And each one of these magnets represent the culture in your church. Now you don't have all of them, but you might have a, if you're declining, then you probably have a scarcity culture in your church. In other words, that culture is driven by fear. Obviously, you fear, we can't have a snow day because we can't afford it. We can't lose them. We can't send a member out because we'll die. So there's that. And then there's the level 3 magnet. And the level 3 magnet is that once we start to grow, it's how we fuel growth. We're always asking, the question is, how do we overcome the next barrier? And the solution often is simply by adding, and this is a powerful force. But what it does, if we're not careful, if it's not kept in check, is it keeps us from multiplying. So give you an example. When you're growing, what are you thinking about? You hit a barrier and you say, hey, how do we overcome this barrier? And you know what? If we could add a designated children's pastor to what we're doing, then we could grow. And the answer is you're probably right. And so what we do is we add, and our financial resources, they go into adding. Then we continue to grow. Then we grow a little bit more. And what we come to realize is, hey, we need more space. And so the bottom line is all of our effort and all of our energy begins to go into our addition model. And when it comes down to making choices, do we build a building or do we launch a new location? What do we choose? Well, obviously, I know what we choose most of the time. We're going to choose building a building. If we have an opportunity to send a church planner or hire a staff, what are we going to do? If we have the opportunity to grow a bigger crowd or send out 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 people to start a new location in a new part of our city, what are we going to do? Well, the addition magnet is always pulling us back to addition. And so this is why we see all this conflict between churches that add and churches that multiply.
And sometimes that conflict is internal, and that's what this graphic shows, that it's hard to break out of that level 3 magnet. The idea that if a church could plant 2 more churches and even in so doing may fade, that the kingdom net positive. But what we see in reality for most of the time is that churches who actively plant churches, they actually spurs growth in their congregation. They may not break that growth barrier that they've been trying to break, but combined they do. And that is tell us a little bit about this level 5 magnet.
Yeah, well, let me go back to level 3 real quick, just to say, notice that there's 2 sides of level 3. There's this subtraction component that is on the you're trying to get there, finally you plateaued, and now you're really motivated by, if I could just add these things, then we're going to grow. Then on the other side, it's more preventative in the sense that it's keeping us from making the next step. Now level 5 magnet is or we call it beyond level 5, is when we get to the point of multiplication and everything changes. Like now and I was thinking as you were talking, Mike, how important the scorecard is. Like what we measure is incredibly important. And level 5 is this whole new scorecard and it's not the scorecard itself, but we're motivated by this new sense of vision, and the scorecard is, not how many people we gather, but how many people do we send? Not how many disciples we have, but how many disciple makers we have. Right. Give you a practical example. I went and spoke at a church. A guy had invited me to speak at his church, and I show up, and he meets me at the door, apologizing because of the number that was there. And I told him immediately. I said, "Hey, don't worry. My favorite number is 3." The reason my favorite number is 3 is because that is the number of people that we put into triads, 3 to 4 people, where we are seeing rapid multiplication. I would rather have 3 people in a triad or a quad than to have 300 in a worship service, because I've got this multiplication vision and I know what can become of it. I know that 3 can become hundreds. 100 times 3 is 300, and we're literally seeing that today. And so this level 5 magnet is what happens when we begin to make these transitions, and it's just this incredible pull into the kingdom of God, because everything changes. I can't even explain it, but it's a level 5 culture. That's what it is. It's a level 5. It's a multiplication culture.
How does this culture connect with Oxano's, our legacy work, that a lot of our work is built on this upper room identity, lower room? Connect the dots for us here, Dave.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a way to sort of connect the 5 levels and the magnets with what we talk about every day, right? Lower room, upper room. And if you're on this webinar because you're, a friend of Oxano, first of all, we're thrilled that you're here. And this lower room, upper room. Jesus had a lower room, right? And his lower room was all the crowds who pressed him to consume from him. And he had an upper room, and there was 121 people in the upper room in Acts 1 before Pentecost. And so we often say, hey, Sunday morning attendance is a little bit like our lower room. Our innermost room of disciple making leaders is really our upper room. And then we would say, just real quickly, that the lower room, there's 4 things that people are attracted to: their place, the right place; personality, we love our preacher, or we love our leaders, or we love somebody; programs, hey, we have the best programming in the world; and then people. Now, Mike, I think it's important to say these aren't bad things,
right?
That we want to have a great place, we want to have good personality, we want to have the right programs, we want to have the right people, but oftentimes they can become the thing, and that's when they become the wrong thing. So in the lower room, oftentimes we focus on building a place to attend a service, leveraging a personality, now think about it, let me back up, I need to slow down here. Building a place to attend a service. Is that the church? No, it's an aspect of the church.
Right.
But it's a small aspect of the church when you think about the church, and we'll talk about what the church is in a minute, maybe. Secondly, leveraging a personality. That's what. Thirdly, providing and adding programs. For what? For attracting the right people. That's sort of a lower room culture. That's the level 3 magnet, but to overcome this growth barrier and to really grow our churches, to move towards multiplication, then we have to sort of transition from a programming, attractional, attendance-based magnet or engine, as we might say, or operational system, to this disciple-making operational system or engine. I mean, that's the core component there. And in the upper room,
it's moving to focus on how do I get people to come to my church as a focus, to what am I going to do with the people God brings to me? This idea of having a disciple-making mission, a disciple-shaping values, disciple-moving strategy, disciple-defining measures, disciple-guiding vision, right? So that level 3 magnet has a lot of resonance with that lower room culture that's focused on like making this place run, as opposed to helping our disciples be like Jesus right where they live, and having that be the definition of success rather than how big we get. And now, of course, the being big isn't bad. We're not opposed to that. It's just focus. We want our disciples to have big faith. We want to have big faith. We want to see that Jesus be big in our world, right? So we have to start counting that instead of addition, so that we at this bottom here to form a church that functions as a family of disciples on mission together.
Yeah, and this is really lower room, upper room is one way of looking into it. And here's the objective. Now, this is really one of the things that you'll hear us say, Exponential, Oxano, and many people who are we're actually meeting with 75 next week, 75 denominational and network leaders from around the country having these discussions, and you hear a lot of this, but we talk a lot about minimal ecclesiology, in other words, that we have to have a simple definition of church. And really, so in a lower room, we focus on these things, in upper room, we clarify and leverage. Why? To form a church that functions as a family of disciples on mission together, advancing Jesus's kingdom by making disciples who make disciples and planting churches that plant churches.
So when we think about multiplication, though, with that simple definition of church there, what would you say are the three dimensions of multiplication that are needed?
Yeah.
So that these churches so that we can all multiply.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so three things that are, that we need and we need to work on. Disciple making, obviously, is the core engine. Capacity building, how do we build capacity for more disciples? And mobilization, how do we mobilize ordinary disciples where they live, work, and play, And so these are the three dimensions that we have to work at, and they're all in tension. They're all in tension. This is a tension diagram. Notice on one side is really on the left-hand side is addition. On the right-hand side is multiplication. But the tension is adding capacity and multiplying capacity. And here's a little bit of how it's played out. So if you look at under adding disciples, we add disciples. This is the Jesus way. We add disciples one at a time relationally. That's how you make disciples. Disciple making is not a program, it's a relationship. So we do add disciples, but we add disciples by going to the other end of the tension diagram, multiplying disciples. We add a disciple who goes out and makes a new disciple. He's a disciple maker. But what we've done is we've taken that Jesus way of making disciples, read the Gospels, and we've turned it into programs. And so we have programs for making disciples. And what programs do is they don't reproduce, they consume all of our resources, which leads us to the second tension here, living in common and living deployed, which is the idea of mobilization. So how do we mobilize? And on the addition end, this is, by the way, there is a balance, and this is what the tension diagram is showing. There is a balance between addition and mobilization. Addition is not bad. It's only bad when it supplants multiplication. But the church, if you read Acts 2, that's a picture of the church living in common. And so the church was formed to live as a family of disciples that would be so compelling that it would attract people to it. And we see that happening. We see the church with favor. What we ended up with was programs. And when you have programs, what does it take to run programs? You got to have volunteers.
Yeah.
And the more programs you have, the more volunteers you need. And guess what doesn't happen? People don't live deployed. Matter of fact, sometimes when I talk with pastors, they are very resistant, and I'm a pastor, and I have been here. They are very resistant to people living deployed because they feel like it takes away from the church.
Right. Well, I think there's real tensions here as we think about those traditional adding habits that we have. Someone comes to faith, and we want to make sure that they're discipled before they go disciple someone. And I'm hearing you suggest that we can shorten that time frame drastically, that we can employ new believers and reaching new believers. If we don't do that, we're never going to multiply.
Well, the great thing about new believers is they know lost people. And if you don't deploy them, you're going to miss an opportunity, So new disciples are made through mobilizing new disciples and older disciples as well. But when you are so focused on addition, there's no one or no time to mobilize, and that becomes the problem,
So if we're going to see multiplication movements that leverage these three, what do we have to do?
Yeah. So Yeah, so there's three things real quick here, and we'll make them quick. One, listen, make disciples who make disciples the right way Jesus did. And listen, let me just say this. I'll be glad to share resources with you. The tool that we use, I didn't put it in here, but maybe Bob will drop it in a link to our planningthegospel.com page that has some really simple tools that are free for making disciples who make disciples. Listen, start small, start where you are. Again, it's a relationship, not a program, but number one, you got to begin by making disciples who make disciples the Jesus way. The second one is you got to release disciple makers who carry the fullness of Jesus into every corner of society. Now, notice the first one I call disciple making engine, the second one, gospel saturation. We got to recognize that our job, is gospel saturation, that the gospel would be accessible to everybody in our community, in our world, ultimately. And so if that's going to happen, every believer, every new disciple is a missionary. And most of them are working and connecting and living in neighborhoods, playing on ball fields, et cetera, you know. And so these are simple solutions, but they're a different way of working for most of us. And then the third one is we need to send everyday missionaries to start, and this goes a little bit further than what I'm just talking, gospel saturation. I sort of ran into this one, but send everyday missionaries to start new gatherings of disciples where they live, work, and play, you know. So, you know, I remember going to one of my pastor friends, it's still a dear friend of mine, we worked together, and I asked him, I said, will you help me plant 10,000 churches? And he looked at me and he says, do you even know 10,000 church planners? I said, no, I don't even know one. I said, but we're asking the wrong question here. We can raise up 10,000. And I remember years ago hearing Tom Clegg and Bob Logan. Some of you don't even know their names. They used to be like the guys who were sort of really first up on the church planning stage. And I remember hearing them say years ago that every member is a church planter. Every person is a potential church planter. That's what they were talking about 30 years ago, Mike. You know. And what they were doing, they were seeing something that we were having trouble seeing at the time because we figured out church growth. You know, I wrote a chapter in a book called How to Get Off to a Big Start. Totally opposite of what we're talking about here. And it worked for years, but it's not working the same way it used to work because we've reached everyone like us or everyone who wants to be like us.
And we're not saying that approach is wrong for everyone today. We're saying that we need more approaches. And we're saying that the core problem here is that churches don't know how to multiply. And we're advocating a new way to do that your church can do, that any church can do, but you just have to learn how to do it, letting go of some things from the past. Tell us a little bit more about our solution, David.
Yeah, so, you know, Mike, it really is, it's not easy, you know, it really is a process. So I always say slow down to speed up. And so what we've done, and we don't have a lot of time, we can do follow-up webinars on this stuff, but we put together a 6-month coaching consulting process that equips churches with a how-to toolbox for multiplying. Bottom line is you're going to have to retool. We'll send this information out to you, so I'm not going to hang out on here, but it's just it's a 5-phase process, and it takes the best of Exponential and the best of Oksana's process consulting, and we put it together, and literally will help a church develop a number of things, but one big thing is a multiplication plan. And you can sort of see, you know, so how do you develop a multiplication dream, multiplication culture, scorecard, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's, you know, that's what we're doing with this toolbox. And but I would just say, simply stated, I would just say, just start, you know, today with disciple making the Jesus way. And and then just if we can help you, reach out to us. In this short webinar, I think on the next slide, there's a QR code with a landing page, and you can say, hey, I'd like to talk to someone. My favorite thing in the world is to sit down and talk with people face to face, or on Zoom. That's sort of face to face, but to talk about your context and what that might look like for you. But for now, we're going to be releasing this at Exponential in 2-3 weeks. And then we're going to be running some virtual collabs. And if a church was interested in it, I'd love to call them, talk to them, tell them about it, see if it's right for them, and have you be a part of a virtual collab that's going to take you through a process to build and implement a plan for multiplication. We're not going to blow your church up. I blew churches up in my 20s and 30s. I'm trying to put them back together now, as I get older.
It's old.
Hopefully a little bit wiser,
Yeah, I love that, David. One of the questions from the chat box is this term minimum ecclesiology. I feel like I'm back in a seminary classroom sitting at the feet of my wizened professor. What does this phrase mean, David?
Oh God, sorry. Yeah, I've got to say everything has to be simple. So forgive me for backsliding there. Yeah, so minimal ecclesiology is we just got to have a layman understanding of what it means to be the church, And to me, the church, again, is a family of disciples on mission together, advancing Jesus's kingdom. Now, does the church do a bunch of stuff? Sure, it does. But I'm just keeping it simple here. Minimal ecclesiology.
Yeah. What are the things that we have to have in place? We could talk, there's thousands of pages of books written on that subject.
Yeah. And let me say, Mike, sometimes that's how we determine if something that we've started is ready to become a church.
Right.
Are they meeting regularly? Are they baptizing people? Are they fellowshipping in the Lord's Supper? Are they living a sent life? Are they beginning to act as a group like a church? And when they are, man, you might just have yourself a church.
Right. I love it.